You're at dinner with a group of friends, and somehow the conversation drifts toward retirement. And someone asks the question that makes everyone at the table suddenly very interested. So, do you think you're on track? And you laugh it off, or you say something vague like, I'm working on it, or you pivot the conversation to something safer. Because the honest answer, the answer you'd never actually say out loud, is that you genuinely have no idea. Not because you haven't thought about it, you've thought about it plenty. Usually at 2 a.m. when your brain decides it's the perfect time to audit your entire financial future. The problem isn't that you're not thinking about retirement. The problem is that nobody ever gave you a concrete, age-specific number to measure yourself against. You've been driving toward a destination with no map, no milestones, and no real way to know if you're behind, on track, or maybe, possibly, actually doing okay. Today, we're fixing that. And this channel is about real financial mechanics, not vague inspiration. By the end of this video, you're going to have specific net worth benchmarks for every decade of your working life, the math behind where those numbers come from, and a clear picture of exactly what to do if you're not where you need to be. Subscribe if you want more content like this because we're just getting started. Before we get into the numbers, I need to challenge something that's probably already forming in your head. You're expecting me to give you one big retirement number, a single target, $1 million or 2 million, or some other round figure that you can mentally file away and occasionally feel vague anxiety about. Here's the thing. That's not how retirement math actually works, and that one-size-fits-all approach is part of why so many people feel paralyzed about retirement planning. The number you need is not the same as the number your neighbor needs. It depends on your desired lifestyle, your expected retirement age, your other income sources like Social Security, and a variable that most people seriously underestimate, how long you're actually going to live. According to the Social Security Administration, a 65-year-old American today has a life expectancy of approximately 20 additional years. But that's the average. 1 in 4 65-year-olds will live past 90. 1 in 10 will reach 95. So when you're building a retirement plan, you're not planning for 20 years of expenses. You're potentially planning for 30. And here's what most people don't realize. That decade of difference between planning for 20 years versus 30 years requires roughly 40% more capital at retirement. The math gets expensive fast, so rather than one number, we're going to build you a roadmap, age-specific benchmarks, real dollar amounts, and the logic that holds all of it together. Everything in this video rests on two foundational concepts, and I want to make sure you understand both of them before we get into the benchmarks. Because if you understand the foundation, the numbers make intuitive sense rather than just feeling like arbitrary targets someone invented. The first concept is the 4% rule. Originally derived from the Trinity study conducted at Trinity University, this rule states that if you withdraw 4% of your investment portfolio annually, historical market data suggests your portfolio has a very high probability of lasting 30 years without running out. So if you need $60,000 a year to live comfortably in retirement, you take $60,000, divide by 0.04, and get $1.5 million. That's your target portfolio. This formula, annual expenses divided by 0.04 or equivalently multiplied by 25, is the engine behind every benchmark we're about to discuss. The second concept is income multiples. Rather than calculating a fixed dollar amount that means different things at different income levels, financial researchers at Fidelity Investments developed a benchmark system based on multiples of your current salary. The logic is elegant. If you're earning $70,000 a year now, your lifestyle is calibrated to roughly that level, and your retirement needs will be proportional to it. So when I give you benchmarks in a moment, I'll give them both ways, as income multiples and as real dollar amounts. So you have two different lenses to measure yourself against. The age-by-age breakdown. Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's walk through each decade with real numbers attached. At age 30, the benchmark is 1 times your annual salary saved. If you're earning $55,000, you should have approximately $55,000 in invested assets. Not counting home equity, not counting the car, actual invested assets. Now look, I know what some of you are thinking right now. You're 30 and you've got $8,000 in a 401k and $4,200 in a savings account. And that benchmark feels like a verdict on your entire adult life so far. It's not. Age 30 is early. The compounding curve is still ahead of you, but it is a signal. If you're significantly below this benchmark at 30, The habits need to change now, not in 5 years, because the math at 30 is dramatically more forgiving than the math at 40. At age 35, the benchmark moves to 2 times your annual salary. On a $65,000 income, that's $130,000 in invested assets. This is where the gap between people who started early and people who delayed starts becoming visible in the numbers. Someone who invested $300 a month from age 22 to 35 at 8% returns has approximately $107,000. Someone who waited until 28 to start that same contribution has about $57,000. Same monthly effort, a $50,000 gap after just 6 years of delay. Time is doing most of the work here, and this is exactly why starting late is so expensive. At age 40, the benchmark is 3 times your salary. On a $75,000 income, that's $225,000 in invested assets. This is the checkpoint that most people find genuinely uncomfortable because 40 feels like the moment when the abstract future of retirement stops feeling abstract. It's close enough to see. And a 2022 Vanguard study found that the median 401k balance for Americans aged 35 to 44 is just $76,354. The benchmark says $225,000. The median reality says $76,000. That gap, roughly $150,000, is the mathematical consequence of a decade of lifestyle inflation, debt, and contributions that never quite kept pace with income growth. At age 45, you need 4 times your annual salary invested. On an $80,000 income, that's $320,000. This is where it gets really interesting from a compounding perspective, because $320,000 at 8% annual returns generates approximately $25,600 in passive growth per year, without you contributing another dollar. Your money is starting to pull meaningful weight on its own. The psychological shift that comes with watching your portfolio generate $2,000 a month in growth without any action on your part is difficult to describe until you experience it. But it fundamentally changes how you think about every financial decision. At age 50, the benchmark is 6 times your salary. On an $85,000 income, that's $510,000. Here's what most people don't realize about this milestone. The IRS actually acknowledges that 50 is a critical catch-up point. That's why at 50, you become eligible for catch-up contributions to your 401k, allowing you to contribute an additional $7,500 per year above the standard limit of $23,000. That's $30,500 a year in tax-advantaged space that you can use to close the gap aggressively if the earlier benchmarks weren't EAT. At age 55, you should be at 7 times your salary. On a $90,000 income, that's $630,000. And at age 60, the benchmark reaches 9 times your salary, $810,000 on a $90,000 income. At this point, your portfolio, if it's on track, is generating roughly $64,800 a year in growth at 8% returns, more than most Americans earn from working. That's the compounding curve reaching its most powerful phase. At age 65, traditional retirement, the benchmark is 10 to 12 times your annual pre-retirement income. On a $90,000 income, that's $900,000 to $1.08 million in invested assets. Combined with an estimated Social Security benefit, the average in 2024 is approximately $1,907 per month, or about $22,900 per year. A $1 million portfolio at 4% withdrawal generates $40,000 annually, bringing total retirement income to roughly $62,900. For most people, that's a comfortable retirement. Not lavish, but genuinely comfortable and sustainable. The psychology of falling behind. Now you might be thinking, I've done the math in my head, and I am nowhere near these benchmarks, and now I feel terrible. And I want to address that directly because the psychological response to seeing a large gap matters enormously for what you do next. There are 2 ways people respond to discovering they're behind. The first is paralysis. The gap feels so large that starting feels pointless, so they don't start, which makes the gap larger, which makes starting feel even more pointless. It's a loop that destroys futures. The second response is urgency. The gap becomes fuel. It makes the abstract suddenly concrete, and concrete problems have concrete solutions. Here's the analogy that I think frames this correctly. And if you're driving from New York to Los Angeles and you realize 3 hours in that you took a wrong turn, you don't keep driving the wrong direction because you've already lost 3 hours. You recalibrate, you adjust the route, and you drive differently for the rest of the trip. Maybe a little faster, maybe with fewer unnecessary stops. Being behind on retirement benchmarks is a wrong turn, not a dead end. The math is actually more forgiving than most people expect, even at 45 or 50, if the behavioral changes are real and immediate. A 45-year-old who is $150,000 behind their benchmark, but immediately increases their monthly contribution by $800 and eliminates $600 in monthly debt payments redirected into investments is adding $1,400 a month to their wealth building engine. Over 20 years at 8%, that additional $1,400 per month generates approximately $831,000. The gap is closable, but only if you stop pretending it isn't there. Look, this video only earns its place in your life if you actually do something with it. So here's the concrete sequence. First, calculate your actual current net worth in invested assets only. Pull up your 401k, IRA, brokerage accounts, add them up, write down the real number. Second, find your benchmark based on your age and current income using the multiples we discussed. Third, calculate the gap. Not to feel bad, to feel clear. And fourth, determine the monthly contribution increase required to close that gap over your remaining working years. There are free compound interest calculators online that will do this math in under 2 minutes. Use them. Then automate that new contribution amount before your next paycheck arrives. Not next month. Not after you figure out the budget. Before the next paycheck. Here's what I want you to take from this. Retirement isn't a destination that either appears or doesn't appear at 65. It's a mathematical outcome of decisions made across every decade of your working life. And the benchmarks we walked through today aren't judgment, and they're navigation. They tell you where you are on the map, so you can adjust the route intelligently. You now have something most people spend their entire careers without. Specific age-calibrated numbers that tell you exactly where you should be and exactly how far you have to go. That clarity is genuinely valuable. Don't waste it by watching this video, feeling temporarily motivated, and then going back to the same patterns. Do the math today. Calculate your gap today. Increase your contribution today. Your 65-year-old self is going to live with the decisions your current self makes this week. Make sure those decisions are worth living with. If this video brought some clarity to a topic that's been quietly stressing you out, share it with someone who needs the same clarity. Subscribe for more content that gives you real numbers instead of comfortable vagueness. And drop a comment telling me which age benchmark surprised you the most. I read every single one.